Welcome to the Architects of Ambition, the podcast where dreams take shape and futures are built. I'm Lyndon Dover, your guide on this journey of discovery and design, brought to you by Weaver, the online platform that's connecting contractors with the visionaries of architecture. Every episode, we delve into the minds of those who dare to imagine and create the spaces we live, work, and play in. Let's get started. Richard, hi. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
Hey, Lyndon. Thanks for having me, man.
Great stuff. Obviously, we're going to talk about small practices today and how they are defining architecture and the design of architecture. But I wanted to get a bit about you first before we dig into the main topic. So maybe you could tell us about your practice, where you're based, and what projects you typically work on.
Yeah, not a problem at all. No, it's I'm the owner and director of Richard John Andrews. I've been practicing for about 5 years. Before that, I sort of freelance and collaborative jobs with artists and other design professionals, whilst also studies based in East London. We work and collaborate with private residential clients. And then recently we've started sort of dabbling with small-scale commercial projects, restaurants, commercial workspace fit-out, and then also having initial discussions with local authorities about community wealth building and placemaking and stuff like that.
That's great. So your residential architecture side, is that a specific area of London that you like to kind of hone in on, or are you sort of agnostic about that?
So yeah, I think we go pretty much wherever the projects are. Like, I've always been very much like that, even right the way from, studying down in Canterbury to working in London, commuting between the two, but then having projects up in Cambridge, having projects over down in Deal, having projects over towards sort of Bristol and Bathway, as well as down in Surrey. So I've always been, I suppose, in a way, like, had that underbelly of like a digital nomad type of workflow, where that sort of followed us into me setting up the practice. So we don't really sort of say, oh, we only operate in East London, we only operate here. It's not really about that for us. It's about like when we can find interesting projects or interesting clients to like engage with, and that sort of like really drives us as a studio, drives me as a person, is like just trying to find someone to engage and talk to and learn about what their life is, and then how we can then translate that into a piece of architecture, which they can then experience on like a day-to-day basis. That's where our sort of focus is. So we sort of go everywhere.
And that sort of forming your business, going back to that, how did you end up forming it? Like, what attracted you to running your own business versus working for a larger practice?
I don't know. It comes across quite bad in the way that I sort of phrase it, but it's not meant to be. It's sort of like the reason I set up my small architecture practice and worked on my own is because I experienced big practice, I experienced medium-sized practice, and experienced small practice. And the one that, as I sort of trickled down through that process, I started out with big practice, as sometimes as big as they can get, like Foster and Partners, and then sort of went through that sort of baptism of fire, worked my way down to a sort of medium-sized practice, worked for Michaelis Boyd Associates, which were incredible, and I saw their sort of growth over a short period of time that I was there. And also the detail and the sort of design work that went into that. And then also worked very briefly for a practice called DOS Architects. And I think it resonated with me what they were doing. So working on residential projects and small-scale commercial projects with a real focus on clients, and then still sort of entertaining larger-scale projects as and when those opportunities came along. And I think that with a team of sort of 4 or 5 people was something that like was quite sort of aspirational to me. It was like I was looking at that as like, well, that is definitely where I want to be when I have my own practice. I don't see myself working in a big practice until 3-4 o'clock in the morning every single night. I want to have a life outside of architecture, and I think that's also sort of driven this work-life balance that, we've been involved in the conversation for that for some time.
Yeah, so I hear that a lot from architects of sort of your size of studio. It's that work-life balance that's really attractive, but I'm yet to find one that's found it, who's actually got the work-life balance.
You're looking at him.
Yeah, great. That's good.
You're looking at, as of 6 weeks ago, you're looking at him.
Nice. Yeah. So you managed to get on top of it, and you've got that. Sort of day How does it work? Is it sort of a day,
not
day
easy.
on?
I think the way in which it works for me, especially, has sort of come out of sort of quite an intense and difficult work period. So actually, over the last few years, including like through COVID, you know, we had quite a lot of challenges in the practice. So, you know, we were all working remotely like a lot of people, but at the same time as that, we had enough projects that we wanted to expand the team. So, you know, we sort of, I suppose, increased in size to 4 or 5 people as part of the team. But then with that brought some challenges. So obviously trying to train people, trying to sort of educate people in the way that you want a project to work, but also trying to make the most out of their experience and what they bring to the table. And that was just not easy remotely working. So I think that because of that, it sort of set up, you know, quite a lot of work and projects that were, I suppose, in my opinion, were run quite in a compromised way, because, you know, you're sort of like flapping around trying to sort stuff out, and, you know, nothing ever takes the time it should do. It takes twice as long, 3 times as long. So I think because of that, I sort of saw very closely through COVID, and then even after COVID, like the aftermath of that, it created a very difficult situation within the studio where, you know, we had a lot of work on, we had some really interesting projects, but we also had a workforce. And so that workforce also, we weren't allowed to furlough anyone. So basically through the whole of COVID, I kept all of my team employed. Now, obviously, when you're working at sort of like 30% in terms of your productivity and you've got 100% of your team there, like that's obviously a very challenging thing to swallow. And we, you know, as part of this journey, I suppose, of trying to establish a practice and sort of failing at things and then obviously improving at other things, you know, we've done other stuff. We've taken on new office space, which was connected to another venture, which was a co-working space, an event space. And that took a lot of time to manage. So, you know, in effect, at that point, a few years back, I was running 3 companies, including an architecture practice that was growing, as well as a co-working space, and also entertaining like the event side of things as well. So it's sort of very, very, very intense for a long period of time over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. And so because of that, we've now, or I've taken a step back and I've gone, look, you know, I actually need to practice what I preach. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep on, you know, working this amount and, you know, sitting there and preaching to like my team members like that, you know, I believe in like a 4-day week, and I believe in like no loss in pay, and I believe in having a decent work-life balance. So it's like, you know, that was the thing that I really do believe in from my experience in big practice, and I wasn't actually doing it. You know, I wasn't practicing it. And so now I am. And in the last sort of couple of months now, we've focused on the architecture work, and I've distanced myself from the other sort of business side of things. It means that I'm really focusing on that. And so it means I can focus on my clients. And the way that works, I suppose, on a day-to-day basis or on a weekly basis is very much like, you know, we have an overall strategy. Our projects are split into, you know, multiple document issues that are tracked throughout a project. And so because of that, it means that we can assess a project quite quickly. We can put in place a timeline and a strategy for that whole project. And then it means that, you know, I can take Fridays off and Saturday and Sunday off, and I can enjoy them with my family, and I can come back in on Monday and I can talk to my team who are doing the same thing. You know, they're using those 3 days for something else outside of architecture sometimes, sometimes in education, sometimes on self-builds, but it sort of gives them that flexibility, and it makes for a far more interesting and dynamic team because you've got outside interests and you're bringing them to try and influence your work inside the studio. And so I've really enjoyed over the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks that's been the reality of it. And I have to say, you know, I've joined a gym, I go on days out, have weekends, have mini holidays, and the studio is functioning really, really beautifully. And we're working with some lovely clients, and the workload is not too much, and everyone is, you know, even getting time within the day to go on lunches with each other, and to talk and discuss what people have been up to at the weekend. So I think, like, yeah, 8 weeks ago, like, no, like I was preaching it and my team members were living it, but I was like flat out 6-7 days a week running 3 companies. But now we've just got a renewed focus on the architecture. The last sort of 6 to 8 weeks has been really, really good, and it's recentered that sort of focus about they work.
That's great to hear, Richard. That's awesome. And that actually brings me neatly on to sort of like the core of what we're going to discuss today, because it's all about small practices. And the title is like how small practices are directing the UK's residential architecture, and that might be one of the things that you're talking about, is this flexibility in bringing, I suppose, cross-pollination from other things that you get up to when you're able to work flexibly within a small practice. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So my first kind of question is, in your experience, like, how do you see the role of smaller architectural practices in shaping the way that we live today in our homes?
I think realistically, and I know that a lot of people sort of don't necessarily want to potentially agree with it, I think that a lot of smaller practices have a direct connection to smaller projects. I think it's sort of, there's a lot of smaller practices that are, doing larger scale projects in terms of value and, in terms of like sort of detailing and a sort of complexity. But realistically, when you get to projects that are multi-residential unit homes, like smaller practices can't deal with that, So you are having situations where someone in a small practice will design the concept design and planning and application for a larger scale development. And then that would then be passed off to another team, which has greater resources and greater experience at delivering that on site. So we already know that sort of collaboration happens within small practice and large practice. But I think that because of that, like the small architectural practices, they have a real connection to the smaller projects. And considering there's data like from the Office of National Statistics is like 40% of small scale, or 40% of the building work across the UK is made up of small scale private residential. So it's like if you as a small practice have like a direct connection to that client base and to that project base, then it means that like you have obviously an influence over 40% of the residential development within the UK. And so it doesn't matter whether it's coming from, a sort of a CAD technician that has a more sort of practical approach to the project and is very much sort of fixed about details and regulations and making sure that everything is sort of signed, sealed and delivered, or whether you've got like more of an architecture design-led process, which is sort of pushing for innovation and sort of like blurring those boundaries between sort of art and detailed architectural construction. I think like all of that together means that we have a greater influence over private residential sector and small-scale projects as smaller practices. And I think that because of that, when you then break that down to say client or the client side of things, like you can then take information from them a lot easier. It's a lot more of a collaborative practice with them. So we can sort of sit down and we can take on board in a few meetings like what our client strengths are. We find that some of our clients have like art backgrounds, some of them have like a construction background, some of them are interested in joinery. So like we're taking that on board. And so it might be that, say, for example, we work with clients that has a brother or a father that has worked in the joinery industry for the whole of their life. It's like, well, let's tailor a project around that. Like, we don't want to tailor a project around our sort of, architectural aspirations and ego to create like a portfolio of work that looks the same from day one until 10 years down the line of practicing. Our practice especially, and I think smaller practices or smaller architectural practices really invite that collaboration with clients, which then creates like a diverse portfolio. So the more collaboration with clients you have and the more engagement with what their skill sets are and what they can bring to the table, it means the more diverse your portfolio will become anyway. And also the more I suppose the more interesting it is in terms of like your work. Like we're trying to unpackage, say for example, someone that works in like data analyst and but then in the evening has like a passion for sort of researching cladding like for 5-6 hours, bringing that to the table. So it's like it's precision based research, and like you can't create that within sort of small scale residential architectural fees. You can't create or sort of fake that level of passion. I think it's those types of things that you have to engage with, and I think smaller practices do that a lot better, in my opinion, because they have more flexibility than larger practices.
That's great. So what I'm hearing from you is it's the collaboration with your client and your colleagues, and getting closer to the brief, engaging with your clients more integrally than you might be able to in a bigger practice. And the thing that was quite interesting though is you talked about collaboration within your sphere and maybe your consultants. But do you think, well, I hear this quite a bit from architects, is they're connected in some ways, but they don't necessarily have time to see what their peers are doing apart from the odd award or maybe looking at magazines, etc. So do you think the sort of ununified direction among smaller practices, so lots of you doing different things, is leading to more diverse and innovative designs? Or do you think greater innovation could come from maybe sharing a bit more with other practices?
Yeah, I think ultimately, it does, like the fact that we do work in some ways in slight isolation from other small practices within the industry. I think that does create, like, obviously we have a very different aesthetic, we have a very different drive for innovation than, say, the next small practice. But I think we could all agree that, in the same way as when you learn at university, if you're in a group of people that are all applying themselves to it, then obviously, or to the task at hand, then obviously you're going to have like a greater level of understanding of that subject, because you can't do the same research, you can't engage in the same way as, say, 5 people can. So I think it's quite an interesting point. It's sort of like you are more diverse, or you create a more diverse portfolio on your own, but it would be interesting to see how that portfolio is affected by shared knowledge. I think social media has had like a massive part to play in that already. Platforms and things like that you get snippets of projects. I think that, you'll have architectural practices that may, say, for example, reinforce their process or break from their own process by referencing social media like quite quickly and quite regularly. So sort of looking, okay, that project's just been done, like we'll take inspiration from that, and in order to deliver this for this small scale residential client. Our process is like a little bit more in depth than that. Like we do use references like everyone does, whether it's directly or indirectly, like you are aware of stuff that's out there. So I think that, those sorts of sharing of knowledge and sharing of sort of work and experiences and stuff within architecture is there. Like it is there in social media now. It might be like painted up and it might be glossy and it might be like a finished image, but I think also we're starting to see more now, especially within social media, in terms of like recordings and footage, podcasts like this one and things like that there are discussions and there's presentations that are going on constantly within sort of the architectural industry, whether that's portfolio based or whether it's for a specific reason within a practice, whether it's trying to open up a discussion about one specific topic, like that is happening now. And I think that does offer, that is already going some way to sort of sharing our knowledge base between our peers. I think there are, I suppose, just to sort of rewind on that slightly, is like, I think there are challenges with anything like staying isolated and having your aesthetic driven by your clients and you collaborating with them but not talking to other practices. I just think that with the shared side of things, with the shared knowledge base and experiences and things, I think there is something that sort of needs to be addressed, which is that everyone within small practice comes from a different space. They apply themselves and they work in different ways. So, when we've done sort of research and studies on how small practice works, we've come across people that, take the plunge like me, go out, start trading, start creating projects and so on and so forth with no safety net, no cushion. I think that there are then other people that, say, work within bigger practice and then trade on projects. And then there's other people that are just genuinely moonlighting, i.e. working outside of those working hours, and so on and so forth. So those sorts of three categories of people that would tend to be involved in small projects are really useful to share knowledge between, because me as a small practice owner can then say, for example, help with how to speed up and make a project more efficient. So someone that is, say, for example, moonlighting, or someone that is working in larger practice but doing their own projects, like that side of things is going to be really helpful for them, because they're going to look at like the efficiency of it. They don't have as much time. So in order to solve that problem, they need to become more efficient with how they work. So I think those sorts of knowledge-based trading could be really helpful. I think the sort of, I suppose in a way, the elephant in the room when it comes to architecture in general is like the value. So what is the value of your services? What is your value as a designer? And I think the only issue with sort of collaboration and shared knowledge when it comes to small practices is that although everyone can go about architecture in their own way, and there's nothing wrong with whatever route anyone takes, like obviously I've taken quite an alternative route myself, but I think what's interesting is that if you are working in architecture and you're working on projects, then you should be able to stick with certain criteria that then levels the playing field a little bit. So I think that what we've experienced by sharing knowledge is then that knowledge is taken and then that's used by competitors to improve their performance. But then if those competitors end up being someone that is, say, for example, moonlighting, whilst being funded by their salaries through big practice, then what we've actually found is that we're improving the efficiency of someone that is working outside of practice by being underpinned by that money that's coming in from their salaries, which then means that they're able to charge lower fees in order to secure work for their portfolio that they're building in order to leave and set up their own practice. Now that's like quite a common structure, but the problem with that is that in architecture, the same as every other industry that's happened in across like fashion, illustration, like art, like it just means that it's then run by more affluent people. So you get the people that can work for free or work for lower rates or be underpinned by a salary from a bigger practice, which are then squeezing the pot of the smaller practice, which then makes them less innovative because they don't have the budgets to actually deliver that innovation. It means that they can't pay as well in terms of their staff. So then they're looked down upon in terms of like, oh, well, they don't pay as much as what a big practice does. So what we've managed to find is by looking at that and looking at that problem, we're never, and this is something that I've been very strict about in the studio, we're never going to be able to compete with that structure. So we don't even try. And so because we don't even try, we stick with our fee structure, we stick with our processes, our design knowledge, and we stick with the way in which we approach a project. And if someone has a question, we'll answer it. Like if another practice wanted to know how we did X, Y, and Z, of course we'd share that stuff, to a certain degree. But like we stick to those things because we're never going to be able to compete with that structure. And because of that, we have an element of security. If someone wants to appoint us, it's because they're appointing us based on our experience, based on our fee structure, based on the process of a project. And so because of that, it means that we have that level of security and we can then go forward knowing that we're delivering projects in that way. And I think that shared knowledge base is really useful to understand that, because otherwise you'd be indefinitely chasing your tail to try and work out what structure to have, which is the best structure to challenge people that have an alternative route to architecture. And I just don't think there's any point. And I think as long as you're okay with being in that box, like you've got the moonlighters, you've got the big practice with small projects, you've got the small practice with small residential clients, as long as you're fine with that sort of area of expertise and the way in which you deal with that, I just think you should be secure in that. And you might win, you'll win some, you'll lose some, and that's just the way it is. But I think sticking to your guns and like sharing what you know is helpful but doesn't undermine what you do in your practice is the only place that people can be at the moment. because I think there's larger things going on in the industry that don't allow that conversation to continue yet. But I think it's going in the right direction.
To touch on that, like, I think earlier you said there are already ways, apart from people coming direct to you saying, "Hey, Richard, how did you do that detail on this project?" In your innovative design or your cladding or cork cladding or many of the things that you've tried in your practice. What do you think you could be done to create more avenues of shared learning or collaborative design strategies? Take on board what you've just said in terms of being aware that there are different stages that people are in, whether they're jump ship or they're in a small practice or otherwise. What do you think can be done within the small studio network that you know or you don't know yet? What do you think those could be, those sort of strategies?
I think platforms are going to play, or already are playing, a big part in small scale residential architectural industry and construction. I think that the ability to I suppose in a way, like, indirectly share information with an impartial person, I suppose in a much way like Weaver, right? It's like, you're gathering information up, and that information is coming from some of the most innovative and small practices within architecture over the UK. And that information is then used in order to then better your understanding of the industry, better your understanding of what you're delivering as a platform, and then offering things within your platform that would then allow people to sort of take on board knowledge from like an anonymous person ultimately. And so I think like that level of knowledge-based sharing, I think it feels less risky, right? It's like we have a conversation, I tell you like, oh, our fee structure is done in this way. You put that up on your website based on like an overall discussion about something to do with fees within architecture or something like that. That's also probably going to be inputted with another 10 or 12 or 50 other different fee structures, which give you a greater overview of what is happening in the industry. So I, as someone that would be learning from a platform like that or engaging with a platform like that, I would go on and I wouldn't just see one person sharing the inner workings of their studio. I would see multiple people sharing multiple inner workings of their studios. And so then it would be for me to look at like whether or not any of that could influence my practice. And if it could, and if it could better my practice, then that might be something that I'm adopting. But it's not like the sharing, the one-on-one sharing is like, it's quite risky in a way, especially for small practice. Because a lot of small practices will say that, there's sort of 2 to 4 projects away from not having work for a year, right? It's like, that's all it is. So if you share down the pub with another architecture practice that's in your circle, that's in your sort of like arena, so to speak, of competitors, and you're sort of like down the pub going, oh yeah, we charge 12% fees and blah, 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 but we do this really interesting thing and we change this and we change that. And then they rock up at the next client meeting and that's one of your competitors, then you're automatically in a disadvantage. And that could be the difference between one person's salary or your overheads, right, for the entire year. So I think that one-on-one sharing is really risky. And I think that it would be an uphill struggle to get architectural practices to do that. I think if you've got an impartial person or company that is searching for answers to all of these questions and then publishing that in a sort of a fully formed sort of journal of information that then is used to help guide or inform or sort of like solidify like architectural viewpoints from small practice, then it's got to be a sort of win-win, because you're not exposing yourself to your competitors, you're just basically being a part of the conversation.
That's great. Well, I mean, it's got me thinking. I definitely need to do some polls of the current practices that we're working with. Okay, cool. No, that's good food for thought for me. Thanks for the next marketing effort. Thinking about small practices and going back to when you were working in large and then medium, and we talked about the work-life balance, and that's what you were trying to search for, as well as having a hyper control and engagement with clients. As a sort of rounding off this discussion, how would you help other architects, probably moonlighting, let's be honest, thinking about jumping ship from a bigger practice? What would you give them as the sort of maybe top top tips, maybe top 3 tips if you got them, or one or two that with hindsight you would have liked to have known back then?
I mean, one of the things would be one of the main things I think is don't undervalue your services, don't undervalue yourself. Just because you might come from working in a big practice and you might be moonlighting in order to build up a portfolio or to build up I suppose like a nest egg in order to then go out on your own. Don't undervalue your services. I'd far more appreciate competing as a small practice with other people that are charging fees that are appropriate for a project and their scale and complexity, right? It doesn't matter whether you're moonlighting. I've never ever in my life have I ever charged less than the equivalent of 8% fees on any project. Even when I was doing sort of work whilst I was studying, whilst I was at university studying, I was running a full-time project. I've never run stuff at massively reduced fees. We've been quite fortunate that we've not had to, I suppose, because of our design work, because of our social media presence. But I suppose that that is something really key for anyone looking to sort of start their own practice or to go out on their own and sort of work on individual projects. Don't devalue your services, because it then has an impact on the greater industry. And then smaller practices and bigger practices are then in a position where if they're competing with you, they're reducing their fees or not, and then not winning the work. But it means that they're doing that to keep the lights on and to keep their staff employed. And that doesn't create a very good impression of the value of an architecture as the value of an architect to the industry or to the client. And I think the client being educated to the value of the architect at the start of their journey is really, really important. And I think that would be one of my first tips is, don't devalue yourself. You are qualified. Doesn't matter whether you're working for a practice or whether you're moonlighting or whether you're doing whatever you're doing, you should still be charging your appropriate fees. You shouldn't just be charging something because you have a salary coming in. You should be charging what you deserve to be charging. I think that's one of the pieces of advice I'd give anyone that was looking to start a practice.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's really useful. And in terms of setting up your sort of consultants and your contracts network and your other people finding projects, is there any sort of tips you give people around sort of finding your first projects or finding your first sort of design teams?
So I think with design teams, it's quite simple. I think if you need to really think about, you need to do your due diligence, right? You need to look at them as a company, but then you also need to look at the people that you're engaging with on a personal level. Ultimately, most of these consultants, like structural engineers, they'll be involved in the project for the lifespan of the project. Even if some clients opt for the structural engineers not to be involved on site, there's probably going to be a time when they're going to need to be on site. So I think that making sure that they're on a personal level, that you can work with these people. You don't want to make your life a nightmare for 12 months if you don't need to. I think that's sort of one sort of deciding factor. I think also just making sure that you, in terms of the company structure as well, is do you resonate with what they're doing? If you have a structural engineers firm that works 7 days a week, well, they're probably not going to be the right sort of fit for us, because we run a 4-day week and we're not ashamed about it. So it's sort of so we're not going to be probably that compatible. And then obviously on the design element of it, just making sure that are you working with a structural engineer who purely focuses on the technical ability of the building, or are you in need of a structural engineer that's going to offer, say, for example, some design-led approach? If you've got exposed structure within a proposal that you're doing, then you want someone that's going to be focused on the design as much as you are. And a little tip, I suppose, with that is a lot of structural engineers that work with artists are really incredible at detailing. So when they are working with sculptors and they're creating large art installations, they understand detailing like no one else. So I think that maybe if you're looking at more design-led projects with finer detailing, maybe look at structural engineers that have a diverse portfolio, maybe dabble in arts, installations, set design, those sorts of things, as well as pieces of architecture, rather than the sort of mass structural engineers that deal with large-scale residential or large commercial buildings. I think that would be like a good piece of advice in terms of consultants. I think you was asking about at the client side, how do you find clients? For us, like, it's always been pretty organic. That's like hard to hear from anyone that has not had the phone ring and asked them if they could do a set of drawings. But it is, I think it's down to the level of commitment that you put into your communication and networking and making yourself exposed within an industry. So like a lot of our work has come from, me really fighting to put one of our first collaborative projects out into press, even though that project, there was reservations from the client to put it out into press. And I think because that did go out, it then gave me as an individual a level of exposure to being associated with like quite a high level of design. And so then because of that, I then reinforced that with social media, and then reinforcing that with social media, I then sort of took on this sort of narrative of being able to share stuff with clients through social media that also gave me a level of exposure. So I shared the self-build of our extension and renovation project called a Cork House, and also the Light Shed, which is the little private studio down the bottom of our garden. All of that was shared on a day-to-day basis on social media. So I think the combination of like people feel like they're engaging with you as a person and also seeing what you're creating professionally, I think is quite a nice little balance. And ultimately, if you are going to be the director or the face of a practice, and you have aspirations to become involved in sort of quite high profile projects, then you are going to have to accept at some point that you have to be the face of that practice. So there is going to be a link between who you are as a person and whether anyone can fucking tolerate you, sorry. But also whether or not you're a great professional and whether or not you can deliver on what is required. And I think that combination is really important. So I think in terms of like how to work with clients and also how to work with design consultants, I think there has to be a small scale level architecture. There has to be a personal approach to it.
That's great. That's really good. No, thank you, Richard. That's really insightful, especially for someone starting up their new practice. So if someone wanted to reach out, whether it's to share ideas or to ask you about yours or to talk to you about your studio, how would they go about doing that? What's the best way?
So I think Instagram's really good for us. It keeps it sort of engaged on the platform, and that's sort of I'm on there quite a lot in terms of sort of communication. I have dropped the ball on posting at the moment, so I've been getting daggers from certain people in the studio that want to show off our new work. But it's great for us in terms of keeping in contact. And then obviously, standard ways, LinkedIn, I'm sort of on there individually. The company's on there as well. Again, we're trying to sort of up our engagement with other platforms like LinkedIn, Instagram, and and then sort of venturing into other stuff, more video-based stuff when we've got more content. So I think any of those sort of social media platforms are pretty easy to get hold of us as a studio. I think if it's more official, like if it's something that wants to be discussed in depth, or if someone wants to talk about, maybe sharing more experience or more knowledge and things like that, then obviously over our email address for the studio, which can be found on our website. But that's usually the best way. We do occasionally we have a chat function on our website, so sometimes people put out inquiries and requests through that, and our sort of mailing list as well. So any of those sort of forms of communication work for us, and we can pick them up when they come in.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Richard. Cheers for sharing your thoughts.
Not a problem. My pleasure.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Architects of Ambition. I'm Lyndon Dover, thanking you for joining us on this podcast, proudly presented by Weaver, where connections are more than just blueprints. They're the building blocks of reality. Until next time, stay ambitious and keep designing those dreams.